Hands clenched the moment the paper hit the table. A letter home was the last thing any of them expected to be allowed. No one moved. The room, so used to orders, didn't know what to do with quiet. Kenji Sato kept his eyes on the floor, hands flat on his thighs the way he'd been trained. Don't react. Don't question. Don't invite attention. Still, the paper sat there, pale against the dark wood, like it had drifted in from a different world. The interpreter spoke softly, almost as if he was afraid to disturb something fragile. "You may write one letter," he said. "Home." For a moment the word didn't register. Then it hit harder than any command ever had. Around the table, men shifted in their seats. Someone inhaled sharply. Another man pressed his lips together as if holding something back. A letter wasn't just ink and paper. It was hope. And hope, they'd been taught, was dangerous. Hiroshi Tanaka leaned forward just enough to be heard. "It's a test," he whispered. "It has to be." Kenji didn't answer, but he felt the same fear tighten in his chest. From the first day of training, they'd learned the rule: capture erased you. Mercy was a lie. Silence was the only dignity left. Along the wall, an American guard, Miller, stood watching. No rifle raised, no anger in his posture. He looked less like a victor and more like a man waiting to see how strangers would choose. That unsettled Kenji more than cruelty would have. "If you decide not to write," the interpreter added, "there will be no punishment." No punishment. The words didn't make sense. Consequences were the air they breathed. The idea of choice, real choice, felt unstable, like stepping onto ground that might give way. Pencils were placed on the table one by one. The soft taps echoed louder than boots ever had. Kenji stared at the nearest one. Its paint was chipped. Someone else had used it before. Someone else had trusted it. A young prisoner reached for a pencil, his hand shaking so badly it rattled against the wood. He stopped, stared at his fingers, then slowly set it back down. No one judged him. Everyone understood. Kenji's thoughts betrayed him, drifting to his mother's home. The low murmur of the radio in the mornings, the smell of rice, the careful way she folded letters, even scraps of paper, as if words were something sacred. He pushed the memory away. That life was over. Or so he'd believed. "If you write," Hiroshi whispered, "and the letter arrives, home will know you surrendered." Shame settled between them, familiar and heavy. Shame had always been their armor, but now it felt like a weight pulling them under. Time stretched. No orders came. The paper waited. Kenji realized his hands were trembling just a little. He pressed them harder against his legs, grounding himself. Outside, a bird called. The world kept going, unaware of the quiet battle taking place inside this room. The interpreter, Nakamura, finally spoke again, gently. "Some people think writing makes them weak," he said. "Sometimes it just reminds them they're still alive." Alive. The word stayed with Kenji. Survival had become routine, mechanical. Being alive felt like something else entirely. He reached forward just far enough to feel the edge of the paper beneath his fingertips. Smooth, ordinary, real. Then he pulled his hand back. Hope could break a man faster than hunger ever could. And yet, as he stared at the blank page, one thought refused to leave him. What if the letter arrived? What if, across the ocean, someone opened an envelope and saw his handwriting and remembered him as more than a soldier, more than a prisoner, but as a son? No pencil touched the page yet, but something had already changed. Because that blank paper wasn't just an offer, it was a question. And answers like that don't stay quiet for long. If stories like this matter to you, stories where small moments carry the weight of history, this is exactly why History Captured exists. Share it with someone who believes the past is more than dates and battles, and stay with us as this story unfolds. The paper stayed where it was, and with every passing second it felt heavier. No one needed to say it out loud, but they all felt it, the pull backward, not toward the guards, toward something older, something drilled into them long before this room, before this war. Kenji had learned it as a boy, sitting cross-legged on a cold floor, listening to men who spoke softly and never smiled. A soldier didn't surrender. A soldier didn't explain. A soldier disappeared if he had to, but he didn't return. especially not with words. Writing a letter home wasn't just risky, it felt forbidden. Around the table, men stared at the paper like it was bait, like if they reached for it, something unseen would snap shut. Hiroshi Tanaka closed his eyes for a moment, longer than a blink, shorter than rest. When he opened them, they looked tired in a way sleep never fixes. "They don't need to punish us," he murmured. "We'll do it ourselves." Kenji understood exactly what he meant. Back home, families weren't taught how to welcome men who returned in defeat. Silence was easier. Silence spared everyone the questions. A son who never came back could still be brave. A son who wrote from captivity that was harder to explain. Kenji imagined his mother opening a letter with his name on it. Her hands would hesitate. Her smile might come too late or not at all. He hated himself for imagining it, but the thought was there, sharp and unwelcome. Along the wall, Miller shifted his weight. Not impatient, just human. Kenji watched him from the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of it. The man didn't look like someone enjoying power, he looked uncertain. Like he knew this mattered in ways he couldn't fully control. That made it worse. Cruelty was easy to understand. Kindness wasn't. The days before capture came back in fragments. Orders barked over wind. Faces hardened into something distant. The last letter Kenji had written was rushed, careless, folded with hands that shook from exhaustion, not fear. He told his mother not to worry. He'd believed it himself. Now worry was the only honest thing he could offer. Nakamura stood quietly near the door, arms at his sides. He'd heard every whisper. He didn't interrupt. He knew better. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "In some places," he said, "letters are how people stay alive when they are apart." No one answered. "In other places," he continued, softer now, "letters are proof you survived something you were never supposed to." That landed. Kenji thought of all the rules that had shaped him. Don't stand out, don't shame the family, don't speak unless spoken to. Writing now felt like breaking all of them at once. Across the table, the young prisoner from earlier stared at the pencil like it might roll away. His foot tapped once, then stopped. He glanced at the guard, then at the interpreter, then back at the paper. His throat moved as he swallowed. Kenji wondered what name haunted him. Silence stretched again, thick and awkward. The kind of silence where memories fill every gap. Kenji remembered training marches before dawn, cold air biting his lungs. Someone ahead of him stumbling, quickly pulled back into line. No one spoke. You learned early that quiet meant survival, but this quiet was different. This quiet asked something of them. "If the letter never arrives," Hiroshi said quietly, almost to himself, "then we've said goodbye for nothing." Kenji nodded slowly. But another thought crept in, unwelcome and stubborn. What if it did arrive? What if words crossed the ocean when bodies could? What if paper carried more than shame? What if just once the world didn't behave the way they'd been warned it always would? The pencil was still there, waiting. Kenji noticed something else then. No one was watching his hands. Guards weren't counting breaths. No one barked his name. No rule followed him when he shifted in his seat. Choice sat in front of him, quiet and dangerous. He thought of all the times he'd been told what honor looked like, straight backs, silent mouths, vanishing without complaint, but honor had never asked how it felt to be forgotten. It had never explained what to do with loneliness. Nakamura caught his eye just for a second, no urging, no pressure, just acknowledgement. Kenji looked back at the paper. For the first time since the room had gone quiet, his fear changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, like something that could either drag him down or anchor him to something real. Around the table, men were no longer frozen. They weren't writing, but they weren't statues either. Backs shifted, hands flexed, breath slowed. Something was loosening. Kenji didn't know if he would be the first. He didn't know if he would write at all. But he knew this much. The offer had cracked something open and it wouldn't close again. Because once a man is reminded he has a voice, silence stops feeling like safety. And the paper, still blank, kept asking its question. The pencil rolled an inch closer to the edge of the table. No one touched it, but everyone saw it. That tiny movement did something to the room. It broke the spell just enough to remind them this wasn't a dream. Objects still moved. Decisions still waited to be made. Kenji noticed his breathing first, slow, careful, like he was trying not to be heard by his own thoughts. Around him, the silence had changed. It wasn't frozen anymore. It was tense, loaded. Like the moment before someone steps forward and everyone knows it matters. The young prisoner, the one who'd pulled his hand back earlier, shifted in his seat, just once. He wiped his palm against his trousers and stared at the pencil again. His jaw tightened. Whatever was happening inside him, it was louder than the room. Kenji wanted to tell him not to rush. He wanted to tell him to wait, but he didn't, because part of him needed to see what would happen. The pencil scraped softly as the young man picked it up. The sound was small, barely anything, but it landed hard. Every head turned. Even the guards felt it. Miller straightened slightly, not tense, just alert. The young man hesitated, pencil hovering above the page. His hand shook, not wildly, just enough to show this cost him something. No one spoke. The room seemed to lean in. He lowered the pencil and wrote the first character of his name. Slowly, carefully. Like each stroke might be taken away if he moved too fast. When he finished, he stopped, staring at it as if he didn't quite believe it was there. Ink on paper, proof. A sound escaped him then, half breath, half something else. Relief maybe, or fear catching up. Kenji felt his chest tight, not because the young man had written, but because nothing happened. No shout, no punishment, no order to stop. The paper didn't vanish. The guards didn't move in. The world didn't correct him. Hiroshi exhaled, long and quiet. It sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "He's done it now," he whispered. "There's no taking that back." Kenji watched the young man add another character, then another, each one steadier than the last. The shaking eased. His shoulders dropped a fraction, like he'd set something down he'd been carrying for too long. Something loosened in the room. A man 2 seats away leaned forward just a little. Another prisoner cleared his throat. Somewhere behind them, a foot shifted. The stillness cracked, but gently, like ice starting to thaw. Kenji realized he'd been waiting for the guard to intervene. Miller didn't. He watched, hands at his sides, expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction there, no triumph. If anything, he looked careful, like he understood the weight of what he was witnessing. When the young man finished writing his name, he stopped again. The pencil hovered. For a moment, it seemed like he might break, like the effort of starting had taken everything he had. Then he wrote one more line, "Mother," just that. Kenji looked away. He didn't mean to, it just happened. The word cut too close. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Across the table, Hiroshi blinked rapidly and stared at the ceiling as if searching for something there. "Fools," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "All of us." And yet he didn't look angry. The young man set the pencil down carefully as if it were fragile. His hands were steady now. He sat back, eyes unfocused, like someone who just crossed a line he could never uncross. Nothing exploded, nothing ended. The paper stayed on the table, holding a name and a single word that meant everything. Kenji felt it then, the shift he'd been trying not to acknowledge. Fear was still there, but it was changing shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't freezing him in place. It was pulling him forward. He glanced at the pencil. For the first time, he didn't imagine punishment when he thought of picking it up. He imagined his handwriting, awkward, careful, familiar. He imagined the weight of his own name returning to him. Around the table, more men leaned in. No rush, no scramble, just the quiet understanding that the door had opened. Someone had stepped through. And now the question wasn't whether it was allowed anymore. It was who would be next. The letters didn't leave the camp right away. And in that waiting, something else began to move. Days passed, then more. The paper was gone now, sealed away somewhere beyond the fences, beyond their sight. What remained was the space it had opened up, a space that refused to close again. Men started marking time differently, not by meals or roll calls, but by thoughts they couldn't shut off. Kenji found himself replaying the feel of the pencil between his fingers, even though he hadn't touched it yet. He could still imagine the sound it made, soft, certain, Across the compound, small changes appeared. A man standing a little straighter, another humming under his breath before catching himself. At night, conversations lasted longer, not louder, just longer, stretching into places they'd avoided before. "What did you write?" someone finally asked. No one answered at first. Then the young man, the one who'd written his name first, spoke without looking up. "I told her I'm still here," he said. "I didn't say where, just here." That was enough. Kenji noticed the guards, too. Miller still walked the perimeter the same way, still kept his distance. But there was a softness now, like he was watching something fragile take shape and didn't want to be the one to break it. Nakamura carried the weight differently. He moved carefully, choosing words like they mattered more than usual. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, as if measuring the cost of saying too much. On the other side of the ocean, the letters traveled slowly, slower than any of them could imagine, through hands they'd never see, through rooms that smelled nothing like this place, through sorting tables and mailbags and long, quiet stretches of distance. Kenji tried not to picture it. When he did, it hurt. He imagined his mother opening the door to the postman, the hesitation before taking the envelope, the way she might turn it over once, twice, searching for something familiar. Her breath catching when she saw his name, or worse, her not believing it at all. At night, he lay awake listening to the camp settle, wind against canvas, a cough somewhere down the row, the dull sound of boots on gravel, ordinary sounds made unbearable by the waiting. Hiroshi broke the silence one evening. "If no letters come back," he said quietly, "at least we spoke once more." Kenji nodded, though the thought terrified him. Speaking once more felt worse than silence. Silence didn't raise expectations. Weeks passed. Then one morning the routine broke. Names were called, not numbers. Names, heads lifted all at once. Men froze where they stood. Kenji's heart slammed so hard he thought it might give him away. The young man stepped forward when his name was spoken, his face drained of color. He walked slowly, like his legs might forget how. When he was handed an envelope, he stared at it as if it might vanish if he blinked. He didn't open it right away. Neither did anyone else when more names followed. Back at the table, the room filled again, not with fear this time, but something heavier, something unsteady. Hands shook, throats tightened. A few men pressed their palms together, knuckles white. When the young man finally tore the envelope open, the sound was loud in the quiet room, paper against paper. He unfolded the letter once. Then again, his breath caught. Tears spilled before he could stop them. No sobbing, no sound, just tears sliding down a face that had forgotten how to make them. "She knows," he whispered. "She knows I'm alive." Kenji felt his knees weaken. Around him, men turned away, staring at walls, ceilings, anywhere but at their own breaking faces. Even the guards looked down. No one mocked, no one spoke. More envelopes opened, more hands trembled. Some men laughed quietly, disbelieving. Others cried without shame. A few sat completely still, as if afraid the moment might shatter. Kenji hadn't received one yet. He told himself not to hope. He told himself it was enough to witness this, enough to know the world had answered someone. But deep down, a fragile thread pulled at him. Across the room, Hiroshi unfolded his letter slowly. His hand steadied halfway through. When he finished, he closed his eyes and bowed his head, not in defeat but in something like thanks. Outside, the camp looked the same. Same fences, same guards, same sky. But inside that room, something irreversible had happened. Words had crossed an ocean. And once that happens, nothing is ever quite as closed as it was before. The question now wasn't whether letters could reach them. It was what would happen to the men who had been found again. The replies didn't come all at once, and in a strange way that made them harder to bear. Some days names were called, other days none at all. Hope learned how to pace itself, how to sit quietly without drawing attention. Men stopped asking who might be next. They listened instead, listened for footsteps, for envelopes brushing against fabric, for any sound that meant the waiting had shifted again. Kenji told himself he was prepared. He told himself that watching others receive letters was enough. That the relief on someone else's face should be proof that kindness could survive even here. But every time a name was called that wasn't his, something inside him tightened and didn't fully release. When his name finally came, it didn't sound real. Kenji Sato. The room tilted, just slightly, enough that he had to steady himself before stepping forward. His legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. He didn't look at the guard's face when the envelope was placed in his hands. He couldn't. He stared at the paper instead. Thin, ordinary, heavy. For a long moment he didn't open it. He thought of all the ways this could go wrong, of words that might never have been written, of silence that might arrive in ink instead, of a world that had already moved on without him. Hiroshi's voice reached him, low and steady. "Whatever it is," he said, "you're not alone." Kenji nodded once. His fingers tore the edge of the envelope, slowly, carefully, as if the paper itself might protest. He unfolded the letter and saw her handwriting immediately. Uneven, familiar, alive. His breath left him in a rush. She hadn't written much, just a page, simple sentences. She told him about the garden, about the radio still working even when the signal faded, about how she prayed every morning even when she didn't know what to pray for anymore. And then she wrote the line that broke him. "I thought you were gone, but I kept your letters anyway." Kenji felt his knees weaken. He lowered himself onto the bench, letter still clutched in his hands. Tears came before he noticed them. Hot, uncontrollable, blurring the words he was trying desperately to hold onto. Around him, the room shifted again. Some men read in silence, lips moving without sound. Others pressed their letters to their chests like shields. One man laughed openly, a short, disbelieving sound that turned into sobbing before anyone could stop it. No one told him to quiet down. Even the guard stepped back. Miller turned his face away, pretending to adjust something on his belt. Nakamura stood very still, eyes fixed on nothing, like he was giving the moment as much space as it needed. Kenji read the letter twice. Then a third time. Each pass made it more real. Each word anchored him further back into a world he'd been trained to erase. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't erased. He was still someone's son. The room stayed like that for a long time. No orders, no schedules. Just men holding pieces of paper that had traveled farther than any of them ever would. When the moment finally loosened its grip, it did so quietly. Someone folded a letter. Someone else wiped their face with the back of a sleeve. Life didn't return all at once. It seeped back in slowly. Hiroshi sat beside Kenji, his own letter folded neatly in his lap. "I used to tell my students," he said softly, "that words were fragile things." He paused. "I was wrong." Outside, the fence still stood. The war still raged somewhere beyond it. Nothing official had changed. But inside these men, something essential had shifted. They had been seen. They had been answered. And once a man knows the world is still listening, captivity never feels quite the same again. The gates hadn't opened yet, but something inside them had. And whatever came next would have to reckon with that. The gates didn't open that day, or the next. Life in the camp went on the way it always had. Roll calls, meals, work, sleep. Orders were still orders. Fences were still fences. On the surface, nothing had changed. But under it all, everything had. Letters became objects of quiet power, folded carefully, hidden in pockets, taken out at night and read again in the dark, fingers tracing familiar shapes of handwriting like they might fade if touched too lightly. Men who had once avoided eye contact now sat closer together, not talking much, just being there. Kenji read his letter so many times he could hear his mother's voice in the pauses between lines. He stopped worrying about smudging the ink. If it disappeared, the words were already burned into him. "I'll write back," he told Hiroshi one evening, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. Hiroshi smiled, just barely. "So will I." Some men never received replies. That truth remained. And it hurt. But even that pain was different now. It had a shape, a reason. Silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like waiting for a door that might still open someday. Miller continued his patrols, same pace, same distance. But once, as Kenji passed him, their eyes met. There was no speech, no nod. Just an understanding that something human had crossed the fence, even if bodies couldn't. Nakamura left the camp weeks later. Before he went, he paused near the table where it had all started. "People remember the battles," he said quietly. "They don't always remember the moments in between." Kenji didn't reply. He didn't need to. He was living in one of those moments. When release finally came, long after the letters, long after the waiting, it didn't feel loud or triumphant. There were no speeches, just names called, instructions given, men stepping forward slowly like they didn't trust the ground yet. Kenji carried two things with him when he left. One was his letter, worn thin, folded more times than it was meant to be. The other was something harder to describe. The knowledge that even in captivity, even under everything meant to erase him, a simple act, being allowed to speak, had restored something no one could take back. Years later, he would still remember that table, that paper, that moment when fear loosened its grip just enough to let hope breathe. Not because it ended the war, not because it changed history, but because it reminded a group of forgotten men that they still mattered. And sometimes, that's the part of history worth capturing. Years passed, but that moment never loosened its hold on him. Kenji returned home quietly. No parade, no ceremony, just a train ride, a familiar road, and a door that took a second too long to open. His mother stood there, smaller than he remembered, hands resting in front of her like she was afraid to move too fast. They didn't speak right away. She touched his face. Once. Then again, as if making sure he was real. Kenji reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter, the one that had crossed an ocean when he couldn't. He didn't need to hand it to her. She already knew every word. In the years that followed, life found its rhythm again. Work, meals, quiet mornings. But some nights when the world went still, Kenji would think back to that room, the table, the pencil, the moment when fear changed shape and became something else. He learned that history isn't only written by generals or marked by dates. Sometimes it turns on permission, on a choice, on a small, ordinary kindness that moves in the opposite direction of everything people expect. For the men who sat at that table, the letters didn't erase the war. They didn't undo loss, but they did something just as important. They gave names back to the forgotten. They gave voices back to the silent. They reminded men who had been reduced to numbers that they were still human. And long after the camps were dismantled and the fences came down, that memory endured, not as a story of victory, but as proof that even in the darkest systems, dignity can survive in the smallest acts. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause and picture that moment, the blank page, the shaking hands, the first name written, then you understand what history captured is about. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what it felt like.